All right, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that's been all over the news, and honestly, it's a pretty intense topic: the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, we've all seen the headlines, but today we're going beyond what you usually hear, going deeper than the typical Western media take.
Exactly. We're going right to the source, a primary source.
Mm.
So we're looking at this speech given at the UN Security Council, and get this, the speaker's a representative of the Russian government.
Yeah, so think of it like stepping into a whole different world of information. We'll be hearing arguments and viewpoints that, well, might sound pretty different from what you're used to.
It's important, though, right, to understand how different sides frame this whole conflict, even if it challenges what we already think.
For sure. So let's jump right in. The speaker, they don't waste any time. They come out swinging and put the blame for this entire conflict, all of it, squarely on the U.S. They're saying the U.S. support for that 2014 Ukrainian revolution and everything that's happened since, well, it basically started this whole war.
And they go even further. They actually say that without the U.S. getting involved, there wouldn't even be a war. Crimea, still part of Russia.
Right.
It's this whole idea of the U.S. being the one who started it all. And you hear that a lot from Russia.
It's interesting because it's not just blaming the U.S., right? They make it seem like the West has this whole plan, this calculated strategy to weaken Russia.
Right. Like the U.S. is deliberately trying to cause instability in the region just to stay on top, to maintain their power globally.
So they're pointing the finger at the U.S., but they don't stop there. The current Ukrainian president is also in their crosshairs. They're accusing him of, get this, deliberately making the conflict worse.
Yeah, they're saying he's sabotaging any chance for peace just so he can hold on to power and distract everyone from, how unpopular he is back home.
Makes you wonder how often that happens, like how often personal stuff like that, ambition or whatever, how often that fuels conflict.
Totally. And to back up their claims, the speaker gets into specifics. They allege that Ukrainian special services were behind, the assassination of a Russian general.
Yeah.
They also talk about, repeated missile attacks launched from Ukraine into actual Russian territory.
Wow, those are some serious accusations, gotta say. It reminds me of, remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident back during Vietnam, where those attacks on U.S. ships, those reports were disputed, but it was used to, massively escalate the war.
Right, and it highlights how crucial it is to be really cautious about information, especially during wartime,
Yeah.
It's so hard to separate fact from fiction, and each side's going to present information in a way that makes them look good.
So while they're going on and on about these supposed Ukrainian aggressions, they're kind of downplaying what Russia's own military is doing.
It's classic, right? It's like they're saying, see, they started it. Each side trying to control the story, make themselves look like the victim. By making their own actions seem small and the enemy seem huge, they try to justify, why they're fighting in the first place.
And then they make these claims about how Western countries, especially the U.S., are actually profiting from this whole war. They even go as far as calling Ukraine a golden goose for the Western military-industrial complex.
Yeah, that's a loaded term for sure. It taps into this deep mistrust of the West, like they think the West cares more about money than peace. Basically, they're saying the West is keeping the conflict going to make themselves richer.
And they bring up some points like how much profits have gone up for U.S. arms manufacturers since the war started, and how much of the aid that's supposed to be for Ukraine ends up going back to the U.S. through, contracts with those same companies.
They're trying to dismantle this image of the West as, the good guys who are selflessly helping Ukraine. Instead, they're making it look like a shady system that thrives on conflict and prioritizes profit over people's lives.
They even say there's widespread corruption in the Ukrainian government, questioning where all that Western aid is actually ending up. It's a bold claim. It's like they're saying the West is funding a corrupt regime.
That's a classic propaganda tactic, right? Sowing doubt, making your opponent look bad. By saying Ukraine is corrupt, they can then argue that that the West is supporting the wrong side and that it's all pointless anyway.
Makes you think about foreign aid, how complex it is and how hard it is to make sure it's actually being used properly, especially during a war.
Totally. It's a reminder that even when you have good intentions, things can get messy. There can be unintended consequences when you get involved in stuff like this on such a large scale.
Okay, so they're painting the West as the bad guys, but they do acknowledge that this war is causing a lot of suffering. They say that the Ukrainian military has taken a huge number of casualties.
This is where they switch gears a bit, trying to make people feel sympathy and question whether the West should keep supporting Ukraine.
They talk about forced conscription in Ukraine, like the government is desperately grabbing young men and throwing them into this meat grinder without a second thought.
It's a strong tactic. They're acknowledging that Ukrainians are suffering, but blaming it on, on their own government in the West.
And then they criticize the West for pushing Ukraine to send even more soldiers to fight, saying that morale is super low and people are deserting left and right.
They're trying to break down this image of Ukraine being united and bravely resisting. Instead, they make it seem like a society that's falling apart, ready to crumble.
And then they hit us with this statistic, like a bombshell. They say that by the end of November, over 85,000 Ukrainian soldiers had deserted. That's more than 3 times the number from the month before.
That's a huge claim. If it's true, it could really change things. But we have to remember, it's hard to know for sure how many casualties there are in war zones. Those numbers are often manipulated, used for propaganda.
And they go further, saying that even Ukrainian soldiers being trained abroad are deserting like crazy. They say, an average of 12 soldiers a month are running away from training camps in Poland alone.
It adds to their story of low morale and Ukrainians not wanting to fight anymore, even with the West's help. They're painting this picture of an army falling apart.
They even give a specific example in France, where half of a Ukrainian brigade being trained there just took off, leading to the rest of the unit being disbanded. And get this, they emphasize that these were supposed to be the best of the best, the elite of the Ukrainian army.
By focusing on how supposedly even the best units are falling apart, the speaker's trying to make people doubt that Ukraine can even defend itself. It's a calculated move to weaken support for the West, helping them.
So they're not just saying this is a problem for Ukraine, but a problem for the West too, right? Hey, your investment in Ukraine is a waste. Their army is crumbling.
Exactly. They're making it look like the West is throwing good money after bad by continuing to help.
So let's talk about the human cost, the real people. They say that the total number of Ukrainians killed and wounded has gone over 560,000 just in 2024. That brings the total since the war started back in 2022 to a horrifying 1 million.
Those numbers, if they're accurate, paint a really grim picture. It shows just how much suffering this war has caused. But again, it's important to remember that it's tough to verify these numbers in a war zone.
And then the speaker turns on Western leaders, accusing them of basically ignoring all this human cost while pushing for even more Ukrainians to go fight and die.
It's a strong accusation. They're making the West look heartless and indifferent to what Ukrainians are going through. Their words of support don't match the reality of the situation.
They call out, specifically, outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. They say he urged Kiev to mobilize 18-year-olds. It paints this awful picture of young people being sacrificed for a war they didn't choose.
It makes you think about the real cost of war, and whether it's ethical to send people who are so young and maybe not ready for something so horrible.
And they don't let former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson off the hook either. They bring up how Johnson admitted that the West is basically fighting Russia indirectly, using Ukraine as a pawn.
That's a powerful quote to use. It feeds into their whole narrative that Ukraine is just a tool in a bigger game between superpowers, and that no one really cares about the Ukrainian people.
They also quote U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. Remember his infamous statement about how aid to Ukraine is a good investment for Americans because it lets them destroy the Russian army without losing a single soldier.
By highlighting these quotes from well-known Western figures, the speaker is trying to make his point stronger, that this conflict isn't really about defending Ukraine. It's about the West getting what it wants, even if it costs Ukrainian lives.
And to hammer that point home, they mention a report by some U.S. Army Colonel Doug Schmidt, who supposedly called the war in Ukraine an open-air laboratory for the U.S. military. That's a pretty chilling thought.
If that's true, it raises serious questions about whether the U.S. is exploiting this conflict for its own benefit. It fits with their narrative that the West is selfish and using Ukraine as a testing ground without caring about the consequences.
But it's not just about military experiments. The speaker keeps saying the real reason the West is involved is money, plain and simple. They accuse Western arms manufacturers of making a fortune off the suffering of Ukrainians.
That's a recurring theme throughout the speech. Portraying the conflict as a business opportunity for the West, it plays into this deep-seated mistrust of capitalism, like they think the West always puts profit before people.
They even say American arms manufacturers are intentionally jacking up prices for the Pentagon, getting even richer at the expense of American taxpayers.
They're adding another layer to their critique, implying that the conflict isn't just lining the pockets of arms manufacturers, but also contributing to economic problems within the U.S. itself.
And then they drop this bombshell. They say the U.S. Department of Defense did an audit and found out they have no idea where more than half the Javelin and Stinger missiles sent to Ukraine have gone. They even suggest American officials might want to check the dark web.
Wow, that's a serious allegation. If that's true, it raises concerns about how accountable the West is for the weapons they're sending to Ukraine. It could lead to even more instability and conflict outside of Ukraine.
It definitely makes you think about those weapons ending up in the wrong hands, being used in other conflicts or even terrorist attacks.
Exactly. It brings up the possibility of unintended consequences from the West's involvement.
So they spent a lot of time blaming the West for just about everything.
Yeah, they've painted a picture of the West as manipulative and selfish, ultimately responsible for the conflict and all the suffering that comes with it.
But what about Ukraine itself? What do they have to say about the Ukrainian government?
Well, they don't hold back. They describe them as corrupt, incompetent, and totally controlled by the West.
It's important to remember this is just one point of view, one that's heavily influenced by Russia's interests and goals. While some of what they say might be true, we can't just accept it at face value.
Okay, so let's hear it. What's their take on the Ukrainian government? They start by going after President Zelensky, saying he's desperately clinging to power and doing everything he can to avoid a peace agreement.
So they're saying he's putting his own political survival ahead of the needs of his people.
Exactly. They're trying to paint him as selfish, someone who's willing to keep the war going for his own personal gain.
And it doesn't stop there. They claim that Zelensky only has the support of a tiny percentage of Ukrainians, like only 11%. They even imply that he's scared to hold free and fair elections.
Again, it's all about discrediting the Ukrainian government, making them look illegitimate. They want people to believe that Zelensky doesn't actually represent the people he leads.
So they're painting him as a puppet of the West, doing whatever they want and sacrificing the interests of his own people to serve their agenda.
That's a common theme in Russian propaganda, portraying Zelensky as a Western stooge. It reinforces this idea of Ukraine being weak and controlled by outside forces.
And what about the Ukrainian people? Where do they fit into this narrative?
They describe them as hostages of the Zelensky regime, caught in a war they didn't ask for. It's a way to make people feel sorry for Ukrainians while blaming their suffering on their own government.
That's pretty clever. It lets them position Russia as a potential liberator coming in to save the Ukrainian people from a corrupt and oppressive government.
Exactly. It's a way to shift the blame and make Russia look less responsible for all the humanitarian consequences of the conflict.
They even tell the story about Zelensky rejecting a Christmas truce that was proposed by the Hungarian president, Viktor Orban. It makes him look like he wants war and doesn't care about his people.
If that story's true, it reinforces this image of Zelensky as the one stopping peace, the one who's not even willing to consider a temporary break in the fighting during a time that's supposed to be about peace. It makes him look callous and out of touch.
Yeah, and to really hammer that point home, they quote Andriy Yermak, the head of Zelensky's office. He apparently said that real peace talks won't even start until Russia has run out of resources to fight.
If that quote is accurate, it shows that the Ukrainian leadership believes that the only way to peace is through Russia's defeat. It makes the conflict seem like it's going to drag on and on.
So they're basically saying Zelensky and his government aren't interested in negotiating and just want to keep fighting until the very end.
That's the message they're sending. They're trying to paint Ukraine as the obstacle to peace, a puppet of the West that's keeping the conflict alive.
And what about Russia's response to all this? What do they say about their own intentions?
The speaker puts it pretty bluntly. They say Russia knows what the gang in power in Ukraine is really like, and they don't believe for a second that they're willing to negotiate honestly.
So they're basically saying they see right through Zelensky and his government, and they're not going to be fooled by any attempts at talking peace.
Right. They're making it clear that they're in this for the long haul, that they're fighting against what they see as a corrupt regime that needs to be removed from power.
That doesn't sound very promising for a peaceful solution.
It really doesn't. They're saying loud and clear that Russia is going to get what it wants in Ukraine, no matter how long it takes or what it costs.
And what exactly is it that Russia wants in Ukraine? What are their goals?
They haven't come right out and said what their ultimate goals are, but they've hinted at wanting to change the whole security situation in Eastern Europe. They want to make sure that Ukraine can never threaten Russia's interests.
So it's about more than just land, right? It's about influence, about security, maybe even about Russia wanting to be a major power on the world stage again.
That's a key takeaway from this speech. This conflict is bigger than just Ukraine. It reflects this rivalry between Russia and the West, a struggle for power that goes way back and has huge implications.
It makes you wonder, where does this all end? What's Russia's end game here?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. This situation is incredibly complex, with a lot of different players and competing interests. But by understanding the different perspectives and narratives, we can start to grasp what's driving this conflict. And maybe, just maybe, we can get a glimpse of how it might be resolved.
I think that's a good point to take a break. We've covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot to process.
Definitely. But this is just the start of our conversation. There's so much more to explore, so many questions to ask, and so many different perspectives to consider. So we're back, and we just heard a take on the Ukraine conflict that you don't often hear, especially in Western media. You know, this narrative where it's all about the U.S. being to blame, Ukraine being corrupt, and the West just profiting off the war.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. It feels like we've just dipped our toes into a really deep and murky pool.
That's what these deep dives are all about. We're not looking for easy answers or trying to say who's right and who's wrong. It's more about, broadening our understanding, seeing things from different angles, and accepting that things aren't always black and white, especially in situations like this.
To be honest, listening to that speech, it's kind of overwhelming. There's just so much information, so many accusations flying back and forth. It's hard to know what to believe.
And that's exactly why we need to develop a critical eye. We need to look at the information and ask ourselves, okay, who's saying this? Why are they saying it? And what evidence do they have to back it up?
And even when you find evidence, it's often disputed or interpreted in completely different ways. It feels like you're constantly on shaky ground.
That's the reality of information warfare these days. It's not just about bombs and bullets. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping how people think. And in that kind of battle, the truth can get lost pretty easily.
So where does that leave us? If we can't trust any single source, how do we even begin to form our own opinions?
I think the key is to embrace the complexity, to accept that there are rarely easy answers or clear-cut good guys and bad guys. It's about looking at things from different perspectives, really thinking about the evidence and being open to changing our minds when new information comes along.
So it's not about finding the truth, but more like navigating through all these different versions of the truth, each with its own biases and blind spots.
Exactly. And that requires a certain humility,
Yeah.
being willing to admit that we might not have all the answers, that our understanding might be incomplete or even wrong.
One thing that really stood out to me in that speech was how much they focused on the money angle. The idea that the West is involved in this war for financial gain. They kept hammering on this idea of the military-industrial complex profiting from the conflict.
It's a powerful argument, for sure. And it definitely appeals to people who are already suspicious of the West's motives.
But is there any truth to it? I mean, yeah, arms manufacturers make money when there's a war, but to say that's the only reason the West is supporting Ukraine seems a bit simplistic, doesn't it?
It's definitely not that simple. Economics play a role in geopolitics, no doubt, but it's rarely the only factor. We have to consider the historical context, the strategic implications, the moral arguments, all of that.
It reminds me of the debate over the U.S. intervention in Iraq. Some people said it was all about oil, while others argued it was about spreading democracy and getting rid of a dangerous dictator. The truth, as usual, was probably somewhere in between.
That's a great example. It shows how multiple motivations can be at play in these complex situations. And it's important to approach these issues with nuance, recognizing that there are rarely simple explanations.
What about the claims of corruption within the Ukrainian government? Is that just Russia trying to make Ukraine look bad in the eyes of the world?
Corruption is a real problem in many countries, Ukraine included. But it's also important to remember that accusations of corruption are often used as a weapon, a way to smear your opponents and make them seem untrustworthy.
So it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation. It's hard to know if the accusations are genuine or just a tactic to advance someone's agenda.
That's the difficulty with propaganda and disinformation. It mixes truth with falsehood, making it really hard to separate fact from fiction.
So the takeaway here is that we need to be super careful about believing everything we hear, especially when it comes to a war zone.
Absolutely. We can't just accept any one narrative as the absolute truth. We need to approach this conflict, and really any complex issue, with a healthy dose of skepticism. We need to be open to multiple perspectives, and most importantly, we need to keep learning and thinking critically.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Giving people the tools and information to form their own informed opinions. We're not here to tell anyone what to think, but to encourage people to think for themselves and engage with what's happening in the world.
Exactly. In a world overflowing with information, being able to think critically is probably the most important skill we can have.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in the big picture stuff, the geopolitics, the military strategies. But it's important to remember that this war is affecting real people. People who are suffering, dying, losing everything.
That's the tragedy of war. No matter what the leaders are fighting for, it's the ordinary people who pay the price. Families are torn apart, homes are destroyed, lives are lost.
It makes you think about our responsibility to engage with these issues in a way that's both informed and compassionate. We can't just ignore the hard realities.
Absolutely. We need to approach these conversations with humility, knowing that we don't have all the answers. And we need to remember that behind every statistic, every headline, there are human beings experiencing real pain and loss.
I think that's a good place to pause and reflect for a moment. We've covered a lot, and it's heavy stuff to process.
It is. But this is just part of the conversation. There's so much more to explore, so many questions to ask, so many perspectives to consider.
Okay, so we've really dug into this speech, hearing things from the Russian side. And it's clear they're telling a very different story about this conflict than, what we usually hear in the West.
And that's the whole point of these deep dives, right? It's easy to just stay in our little bubbles, hearing only what we already agree with. But to really understand the world, we have to get out of those bubbles and confront ideas that make us think differently.
It's been a challenge, no doubt. This speech was full of accusations about the U.S., about corruption in Ukraine, about the West making money off this war. It's a lot to take in.
And that's the goal, right? To make us really think about what we're hearing, to question the stories we're being told, and to realize that there's always more than one side to every story.
It's easy to get lost in all the high-level stuff, the geopolitics, the military strategies. But we have to remember that real people are caught in the middle of all this.
That's the tragic part of war. No matter what the reasons are, it's always the everyday people who suffer the most. Families are torn apart, homes are destroyed, lives are lost.
It makes you think about our responsibility to be informed and to care, to engage with these issues in a way that's both smart and compassionate. We can't just look away.
I agree. We need to approach these conversations with humility, knowing that we don't have all the answers. And we need to remember that behind every statistic, every headline, there are human beings going through incredible pain.
So what do we do now? How do we make sense of all this information, all these different perspectives, and form our own opinions about what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think the first step is admitting that we don't know everything. We have to be open to the idea that we might be wrong, that our assumptions might be off.
That's hard, though, isn't it? It's easy to get defensive when someone challenges what we believe, to just ignore information that doesn't fit with our worldview.
It is hard, but it's necessary. If we aren't willing to be challenged to question ourselves, then we're closing ourselves off from learning and growing.
Okay, so we need to be open-minded and question what we think we know. What else?
We need to be smart about the information we consume. We can't just believe everything we read or hear, especially when it comes to something as serious as war.
So how do we become more critical, develop that critical eye? How do we know who to trust?
It's all about asking questions. Who's giving me this information? What are their motives? What evidence do they have? And maybe most importantly, are they giving me the whole picture or just telling me what they want me to hear?
That makes sense. It's like being a detective, putting the pieces together from different sources, looking for clues, and always being aware of potential biases.
Exactly. And it's something we have to keep doing constantly. We have to be aware of our own biases, how they might be coloring how we see things.
And be willing to listen to viewpoints that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our preconceived notions.
That's where the real learning happens, in those uncomfortable spaces where our beliefs are tested. That's where we grow.
Something else that caught my attention was how the speaker tried to connect the conflict in Ukraine to other conflicts around the world, like the situation in Palestine.
That was a calculated move. By pointing out what they see as hypocrisy in the West, they're deflecting criticism and trying to position themselves as the ones fighting for a more just world.
It raises interesting questions about how Some conflicts get a lot of attention while others are ignored. Like, why do we care about some things more than others?
It reminds us that international politics is complicated, often driven by power and self-interest rather than what's right or humanitarian.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, all this complexity, the different sides, the human suffering. It's easy to feel helpless.
I get that. But I truly believe that just by engaging, by trying to understand, by having these difficult conversations, we're fighting back against apathy and indifference.
So even though we may not have the answers, even though things might look bleak, it's still worth it to keep learning and engaging with the world.
Absolutely. It's through these conversations, through wrestling with these complex issues, that we can start to imagine a better, more peaceful world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored a controversial perspective on the conflict in Ukraine, one that makes us question the usual stories and think critically about what we're told.
Remember, this is just one piece of a much bigger and incredibly complex puzzle. There are many voices, many stories, many sides to this conflict that need to be heard and understood.
We encourage you to continue exploring, find different sources, have those tough conversations, and never stop questioning, learning, and diving deep. Thanks for being with us on this journey.